going to start off by John thanking you for coming tonight. And the first line from your book that said it was a task of recording what the lives of your father and your father's father, so that our children may know it. And I think that's really what our ethos in the Heritage Group has been all along, is recording what our parents and our grandparents knew and being able to impart that and share that with people. So I'll hand you over to John and enjoy the evening. And thank you so much to Lisa and Vanessa here in Books at One for hosting us as well. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me down at the back? Yeah, okay. I just want to thank you immediately, of course, for being here this evening. It's a lovely gathering on a lovely evening about a lovely topic. There's only one small problem which will be solved in a few minutes, I hope. And I'll put it to you this way: behind this suave exterior, I have to admit that I forgot to bring a fairly important notebook. And my daughter, who lives in Essex normally, is gone down to the house for it. Hopefully she'll return sometime. But in the meantime, I have a lot to say. Now, Mary referred to the story of our father and our father's fathers and so on. And in that notebook, I do know that there is a lovely quote from Cicero, he of Roman times, who says, and I wish to God I had it here because he puts it better than I would do, and it is this: that anybody who grows up without a knowledge of his or her history always remains a child. I think it's very, very important that all of you, and you come from far and near, that you look into your own local history and your own family history especially. Because when I came back here with my late wife in 1972 to teach at Santa Maria College, I'm from here, to teach at Santa Maria College, I remember my mother saying to me, oh God bless you,
That's the first time I've been allowed to drive that car. I got your keys then.
Yeah. I'm sorry now. That our history is so important, and I think we might get Cicero now in a second. Here we go. Cicero said, as I put on the glasses, he says, to be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. For what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by the records of history? And I think that sums it up very well. Sometimes I stand on the square in Louisburgh. I was born and reared on Main Street. And sometimes I stand on the square of Louisburgh and look around, but it's quiet, and think of all the men and women who were the adults when I was a child growing up. And they are all gone. They are part of the mystery now of our past. I'm going to talk to you about the history of Louisburgh. Louisburgh is a planned town. It's a landlord's town. But I won't be speaking specifically about it for a little while. Its date is 1795. It was not built by the landlord John Dennis Brown of Westport House. It was laid out by his architect. He didn't actually build anything in Louisburgh. He did in Westport for weavers and so on, but that's a story I might come on. But I want to talk to you first about the 18th century in Mayo. And the 18th century in Mayo we can divide into two parts. The first part, I will put it to you this way. I'll just quote from a historian. The picture we get of County Mayo during the first half of the 18th century. Now remember, you have the penal laws and priest hunting and all of that kind of thing. Is one of a population highly vulnerable to poor harvests, fluctuating agricultural prices, and famine. Some people say to me, what about the Great Famine? Should about all great famines in their own way. Successive bad harvests brought famine to Ireland in 1728-29 and 1740-41, and near famine conditions in 1744 and 1756-57.
Can't hear you.
Okay, then not.
Do you want this, John?
Yeah, I better do it.
Thank you. That won't come up.
One clue.
Yeah, there's a
I'll
feature.
just- we'll manage.
Yeah. Testing one. Okay. In 1756-57, by all accounts, the famine of 1740-41 was the most devastating in the century, when a series of bad harvests was followed by a frost that lasted 7 weeks in late 1739 and early 1740. Now, I'm emphasizing the 17 part, because when I was at school and I had great teachers, and I will mention them now, the first in primary school was Patrick Ball, God be good to him. The second was in secondary school, or what some of you might call high school. I was in boarding school in Galway. That was Father Martin Cohen. He was a great historian. And last but definitely not least was, at the time at Maynooth University, Father Fee, later to become the Cardinal of Ireland. So I couldn't go too far wrong now that I've got the notes back. But anyway, the frost destroyed the potato crop, leaving large sections of the Irish population with a lack of food. By the spring of 1741, the weakened population was racked by epidemics of typhus and dysentery, which probably resulted in more deaths than did starvation. So that's something to going on with now about the first part of the 18th century. Funnily enough, the population of Mayo in 1706 was a meagre 50,000 to 60,000. By 1752, after that huge famine, it was between 70,000 and 82,000. And by 1791, it was 120,000. And by the early 1840s, it was 347,000 or something like that. So for whatever reason, the population grew and grew and grew. With regard to the famines, 1740-41, greater, relatively speaking, than the great hunger of the 1840s. Huge frost, and I mentioned that in the typhus and so on. The population grew. Now, why did the population grow? Apart from the obvious, first of all, young marriages. Secondly, subdivision. Thirdly, the potato. So, young marriages. People could live on the potato, and there was subdivision, and everybody was happy, and everything would be grand. But really, it was the calm before the storm, as we'll see. Now, after 1750, now this is very, very interesting. Up in the north of Ireland, there was a great linen trade, the manufacture of linen. And it was so good that it kind of fell into the west. They just didn't have enough workers in the north. So the flax would be grown in the west and processed and sent back to the north, until one of the Binghams, now the Bingham family didn't have a great name since the time of Elizabeth I in this county, but one of the Binghams in Castlebar, he decided, he was the landowner there, he decided that something good should be done about this, and he organised a great linen trade. And in 1750, 10,000 pounds worth of linen was produced in Mayo. Girls in their own homes were earning 13 pence a day, which was wonderful. And everybody was happy. Another thing I must mention for the 18th century is this, that if you imagine the window behind me as the county of Mayo, right down the centre, the land was and is relatively good. So there was fairly good produce of cattle, say from Ballina down through Ballinrobe, over through Tuam, and onto the Ballinasloe Great Fair, which still is on the go. The farmers from the Golden Vale came up and bought the cattle, brought them down, fattened them up, and sold them on through Cove to the British Navy. Cove was the feeding station for the British Navy. But that, unfortunately, is going to come to an end sometime, but not now. We're all happy just now. In 1765, you had the Roads Act. Roads were being developed by the Grand Jury of Mayo. The Grand Jury of Mayo were landlords or their agents or whatever who were appointed by the king. So, growing population urged the landlords then to found or find new work for their tenants. It was in the landlord's interest. Not everybody was living in this vein coming down through the centre. It was bad land, especially in the west. So what will we do, said the landlords to themselves. Now, apart from the linen industry, that was fine. The roads were being developed. And finally, you will have the county cess, for example. When the roads were being developed, there was, of course, a tax. The British were very, very good for good, doing things indeed. But there was a tax. And the tax was known as the cess. And around here we used to say, our mothers might say to us, bad cess.
Yeah.
Right? The second half of the 18th century is fine, and Louisburgh, you see it here, kind of sneaks in at the very end. By 1800, 95% of the land of Ireland was owned by 5% of the population, most of whom were Protestant. Now, I'm not talking about Protestant religion. I'm talking about landlords who themselves may have been Catholics, as were the Browns. But when the penal laws came in, you couldn't own property if you were a Catholic. And if you were a Catholic and your son became Protestant, he gets all the land. Now, in 1758, there was a young lad from Westport, there would be, of course, at the siege of Louisburgh in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. This was a huge fortress that the French had built, finished it in 1717, and they were fighting with the British. British were winning, the French were winning. It was back and over like two young lads on the school ground. Finally, General Howe and General Amherst laid siege with their armies to Louisburgh Fortress, and over 8 months it was all over, and Louisburgh Fortress was razed to the ground. Fortunately, myself and local woman Rosalie Tiernan, we were there about 7 or 8 years ago when the two places were being twinned. And the Canadians have the whole place almost rebuilt. They got the plans from the French, and there you go. So that was good. But in 1758, one of the young officers is one of the Browns of Westport, Henry Brown. He's aged about 23, and he's writing a letter from Louisburgh.
Sorry.
That Louisburgh.
Sorry. Would you be able to speak to the
sorry.
microphone if you they can hear you out this side?
Okay.
Thank you.
And he's writing a letter from the Canadian Louisburgh. Well, the Irish Louisburgh hadn't existed yet. And this is the 29th of October, 1759. I won't read it all for you, but he's writing to his mammy. Dear mother, loads of stuff first. And then he says, I received a letter from Mr. Dominic Brown since my arrival, wherein he informs me of your goodness, my dear mother, concerning my bills. The old money. Mammy, thank you for looking after me. And he says later,
Nothing changes.
I should be very much obliged to my dear mother to let me hear from her, and to let me know if I may have any expectations of any small allowance till such time as I may get a company. In other words, till such time as I get a company of my own and start making money. And, you know, it just shows you what was going on. But you can be very, very sure that Henry Brown wouldn't have known much about what I've just spoken to you about in the county of Mayo. He was from a different class altogether. We might find, as we go on, that there was more than one class around here way back in those days. Now, in the next year, in 1759, the British took Quebec. Now, why the interest in the fort at Louisburgh? Imagine if there's a big fortress down at Old Head, and we want to get into Galway, we'll say. The same thing. The French wanted to keep the British from getting into Quebec, because if you took Quebec, you took Canada. So in 1759, General Wolfe and his troops took Quebec, and Wolfe himself was badly wounded and he died. And young Henry Brown, he says that he was one of those who helped General Wolfe off the field, but General Wolfe died. So enough of that. But that gives you kind of a background, if you like, to what was going on in those days. So how did Louisburgh come about? Sorry. Coming on to the end of the century, the idea was among some of the landlords, and especially John Dennis Brown in Westport House, who was married to Louisa Howe, Howe. John Dennis Brown had this Henry. Henry was his uncle. Now Henry's gone off the map, so forget about him. But John Dennis had this Uncle Henry, and Louisa, his wife, had two uncles, one of whom was a general in the British Army and the other was an admiral. So they decided anyway, or John Dennis decided, well I suppose the two of them decided, after founding or getting permission from the King, King George III, to have fairs and markets in Westport, that they would try the same thing out here. So by 1794-95, he had drawn up the plans. He applied to George III, one of the Hanover kings, who was, I believe, a bit out of his mind. But we won't hold that against him for giving permission, letters patent, to John Dennis Brown to lay out a town which will be called Louisburgh. Now, we don't know why it was called Louisburgh. We can presume that with the connections that they had with Louisburgh and Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, that was one of the few times that the New World, or that the Old World took its name from the New World. So Louisburgh was laid out in the form of a cross. The centre is not a square, it's an octagon. To the right, as you come up the main street, is Church Street, i.e. the official church at the time, the Anglican Church. And on the left, you had the Chapel Street, where the takeaway is now. That's where the Catholic chapel was. And in the centre, as I say, you have the octagon, same as you have in Westport. The tenants arrived in and started building their houses. Now we know very much about one of these tenants. Now, instead of holding up this book, will you hold those, Mary, just for a second? I'll just go to a page in the book. He's a fellow named Henry, what is his name? Sorry, Hugh O'Donnell. He's a man named Hugh O'Donnell. And by 1800-1801, he has two tenements where at the corner of Louisburgh, where Seven Wonders is now. He had two tenements there. He also had land in Carriclagan just down the road. So he applied and got permission. Now, how do we know about him? Let me read you this. Monday the 21st of June 1802, I went to Louisburgh, 10 miles southwest from Westport, to Mr. Ward, the parish priest. I proceeded to Louisburgh and slept in a public house, Hugh O'Donnell's, and it cost 1 7d. Wednesday the 23rd, I went 3 miles farther on to Duke McKeown in quest of an Owen O'Malley, a schoolmaster. In the evening, the schoolmaster brought me to a farmer's house, Patrick Gibbons, But I stayed at night and got 2 songs, but I lost my knife. Thursday, Midsummer Day, I came back to Louisburgh, inquired for Mass and told it was to be said 1.5 miles south towards the mountains. The priest, Father Ward, had Mass in a gentleman's house that would be in Garvey's, which later became Harmon's. The gentleman kept me for breakfast, and it was 1 o'clock. I heard a blind piper, a Billy O'Malley. Now I have him circled because down through the years when I was involved with the Quinnell, the parish magazine, there was the odd question now and again, did anybody ever hear of blind Billy O'Malley? And we can now officially tell anybody who's interested that he was a Louisburgh man, or at least from the parish of Kilgeever. I returned to O'Donnell's, got some dinner, had some beer with Tom Burden, a weaver, a quack, and a farmer. All right? So, there was a weaver, so there must be other weavers in the area, but everything was going lovely. This Hugh O'Donnell, in 1797, he must have come from the north of Ireland, and I'll tell you why in a moment. He was a tenant in Carraclagan, and he had 2 tenements in Louisburgh. Now, tenements can mean anything. 1802, Monday the 21st of June, what I've just read to you. 1804, November the 15th, Hugh O'Donnell has got permission to build on a site in the town of Louisburgh. The front will be 80 feet, including 10 feet of gateway if needed, bordered on the north by the street, on the east by Pat Malley, on the southwest by waste ground, lease for the life of the said Hugh O'Donnell, Anne O'Donnell, his present wife. Not the use of the word present there, but I presume it has to do with perhaps mothers to be dying. And Con O'Donnell, eldest son of the said Hugh. Now I'm presuming therefore that this Hugh O'Donnell was from the north of Ireland. We'll talk about the north of Ireland in a moment, because of the name Con. We didn't have the name Con around here. The plot of ground in the diamond of the town of Louisburgh, containing in front 80 feet. So I got that from the Land Commission archives in Dublin. In 1831, in the election to Westminster, Hugh O'Donnell, he votes, only freeholders who held property of £10 valuation or over, and who held leases for at least 1 life could vote. So that would be a small minimum of people from around here who could vote. The valuation was £2 for a long time. But Daniel O'Connell, you remember, pushed through Catholic emancipation in 1829, and the valuation qualification to vote went up from £2 to £10. The 19th of the 12th of 1832 election, Hugh O'Donnell voted for John Dennis Brown. Cute man. Voting was done in public. 1855, Hugh O'Donnell is still with us. How do we know all of these things? From these lists of voters. You know who's around. And by 1901, it's Patrick Morrison and his wife, Kate O'Malley of Boris, who now own that corner house, and their people still do. Kate O'Malley from Boris was my grandaunt, my mother's aunt. Now, how did she get there apart from marrying one of the Morrisons? Well, we'll see in a moment. So, that was the 18th century. Quite good. Relaxed, perhaps. Now, 4 things happened in the first 20 years of the next century. You had the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. So that had a huge effect on this central area of Mayo, and cattle going to the Ballinsloe Fair, and so on and so forth. We don't need them anymore. Sorry, mate. Bye-bye. The collapse of the linen trade. Why did the linen trade collapse? Well, it took about 20 years or thereabouts because of 2 things. Cotton started coming in from America. It was cheaper and handier, and finally, mechanization. So end of, as far as we're concerned back here. We're founded, we're here, okay, what's going to happen now? Absolute disaster. But, as we'll see later, I have two quotes, which I forget where they are, this isn't where they are now. If you had a penny, 1 penny, remember girls have been getting 13 pence? Now they're lucky to get 2 pennies. If you had 1 penny, you could feed your family. If you didn't, you couldn't. What happened to you then? You died. Now, in 1817, 1822, 1831, 1835 to 37, 1842, partial potato crop failure, distress among the population. But think of it this way, when we say distress among the population, all of my forebears and all of Michael's, I presume, and all of Mary's and so on, we are here. So therefore our people must have survived in some way, so therefore they must have had access to money and to trade. By the 1880s or 90s, I remember, having the figures just in front of me here, the 4 fairs that John Dennis Brown was allowed to have with the founding of Louisburgh. Why would he have founded the town of Louisburgh? He was a crafty businessman. Why does any businessman nowadays do anything to make money? The idea was bring in the tenants, get them working and so on and earning money with their whatever they're doing, selling their cattle and so on and so forth. And in my book there's a long list of tolls. It was all about collecting tolls, collecting taxes. And if you sold cattle at the fair in Louisburgh, you paid a tax. And the list is there in the book, a penny or twopence or whatever it was. But twopence was a lot of money in those days. So therefore, things were going bad. In 1831, the parish of Kilgeever, our parish here, had a population of 13,348. There was abject poverty, and you get a lot of information in the first report for inquiring into the condition of the poor in Ireland. You see, one thing about the British government at the time, and from 1800 on, it was straight from Westminster. The Act of Union had come in. And John Dennis Brown, who had been the Earl of Altamont, now became Lord Sligo, which was a jump up really. So they brought in the Poor Law Act in England in the 1830s and here in Ireland in the 1840s. Ireland was divided into 130 units known as unions. We were in the Union of Westport, and of course there would be a workhouse in every union. So therefore now, if you just think of the town of Louisburgh and the parish around it, it's abject poverty. You know, I mean, there's no two ways about it, really. The priests were doing their best, and I'll be talking to you in a moment about a very, very good man who died. The priests and the vicars were doing their best. But what can you do if you have no food and if you have no money? Make them soup. Sure, we see it on the television every night in Gaza. Now, the Great Famine came, what we call the Great Famine. We all know about that, I needn't go into it. But the thing about the penny, if you had a penny, and there's a fair on up the town, where there might be plenty of carrots and parsnips and whatever. If you had a penny, you could buy them. If you hadn't a penny, you could buy. And to top off that, there was the Gregory Clause that was brought in 1847, Poor Relief Extension Act. Any occupier of more than a quarter acre could not be deemed destitute. A quarter acre. That's what we all build our houses on, roughly a quarter acre. If you had more than a quarter acre, you couldn't get any help. And if you couldn't get any help, out you go, and the landlord takes over your whatever holding you had. In 1878, more potato failure, and the Joyce told by the guardians they couldn't grant relief to any able-bodied family outside of the workhouse. Okay, but we'll just stay this side of the famine, of the Great Famine, for the moment. I mentioned a person. He was the Reverend Robert Potter, 1794 to 1847. The Reverend Robert Potter, B.A., was appointed perpetual curate of Louisburgh in 1828, succeeding the Reverend Charles Seymour, 1822 to 1828. Robert Potter, son of Joseph Potter, was born in Galway around 1794. He entered Trinity College Dublin in October of 1811, age 17. He was conferred with the degree of B.A. in 1816. He was appointed curate of Ballinrobe in 1820, and in 1828 he began his tenure as perpetual curate in Louisburgh. Now, the Protestant church, as we used to call it as children, the Protestant church was built in 1798. The glebe house right beside it was built in 1824. And there was about 30 acres of land going with the glebe house. So here we have the Reverend Mr. Potter. In November 1831, he wrote of the parish of Killeen in the Telegraph, "I know no place where there is a better disposed race of people to be found, with few exceptions, than in this remote parish." Robert Potter devoted his life to the well-being of all in this parish. He toiled ceaselessly during the bleak days of the Great Hunger in his efforts to feed the poor of Louisburgh. He wrote in the Mayo Constitution in January 1847. Now, the Mayo Constitution was what we'll call roughly the Protestant paper, the government local paper. The other one was the Telegraph, which became the present College Telegraph. Thank God the clergy of the Roman Catholic and Protestant churches all met each other throughout Ireland on the broad platform of humanity like friends and brothers. So let's just think about that for a moment. The Protestants hated the Catholics hated the Protestants, not at all. They worked together. There's Robert Potter. The Reverend Robert Potter died of typhus fever on Thursday, the 20th of May 1847, contracted when feeding the poor of the parish of Killeen. So now, what have we got so far? We've got now to the 1850s. We'll see what happens next. But so far in the 19th century, things are very, very bleak. But other things were going on at the same time. Way back in 1967, I was a student at the university in Galway, and I was doing what we used to call the HDIP, the Higher Diploma in Education. And this was a handout. We didn't get many handouts in those days. It's a letter of the Right Honourable E.G. Stanley to His Grace the Duke of Leinster, dated October 1831. My Lord, His Majesty's Government, having come to the determination of empowering the Lord Lieutenant to constitute a board for the superintendence of a system of national education in Ireland. Just down he says, I have it further in plan to lay before your Grace the motives of the government in constituting this board, the powers which it is intended to confer upon it, the objects which it is expected that it will bear in view and carry into effect. In other words, they set about setting up what we now have, a national system of primary education. All right? At the same time, and I know I have it in the book that I can't open, there was £150 or something for old head here, and there was also some money put aside for a dispensary. Now we'll be talking about medicine and doctors in a while. Are you all comfortable enough down there? Okay. Are you all paying attention down there?
Q&A is for you guys after John.
I spent 40 years saying things like that. But anyway. Now, the thing is this. The reading of the Holy Scripture without note or comment by children must be peculiarly obnoxious to a church which denies even to adults the right of unaided private interpretation of the sacred volume in articles of religious belief. So the system was going to run into trouble immediately. Father Pat Gibbons, a Westport man, he had done his best for a number of years to have the children of the area, to have the 3 R's, some form of education. And he decided on his own bat, about 1839, to apply to Dublin, to this crowd who were setting up the national system of education, and that his school would join up. The inspector came down, he looked around him, he saw that it was okay, so Father Gibbons got permission. But almost immediately, within 2 years, goodbye Ireland, Archbishop John McHale, a hugely nationalist Archbishop of Tuam, of this area, he said, "No way, Jose. There is no way that I will allow my priests to run schools in my diocese with this thing about education and the Bible and so on." The whole thing closed down. But something must have happened in the next few years. People came together. And they said to Mr. Wilbraham, who was the owner of Old Head House, and he was married to the then Lord Sligo's sister, that's where they were living. "Would you ever come up and we'll talk about you chairing a board of management for a new school?" The people were fed up and they weren't going to wait over the Bible and that. They wanted their kids educated. So sure enough, the system started. Where the parochial hall is now, down in the middle of Main Street, a very, very bad spot, as we might see later. There was a dispensary there and an old house. The dispensary, and it had an apothecary in it, or every day, or 5 days a week, or 7 days a week, whatever. That was moved across the road. The old house was knocked down, and the building was built for boys and girls, 1 story for the moment, with 2 rooms. But then they found after a year that they needed another story. So they built another story, another room on top, with steps outside. The girls went to the room on top, the boys went to the room downstairs. The girls were taught by a female principal and a female assistant. The boys were taught by, you've guessed it, a male principal and a male assistant. So in effect, while it was the one school, you had actually 2 schools, and you had a division between boys and girls, which you didn't have in any other of the schools around the parish. They all started to be built, Achany and Caraniski and so on, over the next 20 years or thereabouts. And they, of course, were mixed schools, and they worked away to their heart's content. So the school was down there, was built in Louisburgh, and everything was fine. So many good things other good things were happening as well. But I just want to point out something. At that time, as that school was being built, the government sent a man named Griffith and his team around Ireland. You see, the poor law had to be paid for. So Griffith and his team went around Ireland, and they laid valuations on every single property in Ireland. And you have the lists. I have them here somewhere. Parish of Kilgeever. In Benown, you had James Grady, the immediate lessor, the Marquis of Sligo, description of tenement land, and he was paying something over £1. And that money would pay the loan that the British government would have raised to start off the poor law. Now, there's a slight little problem that I came across. Actually came across it today. I'm not losing anything that my life depends on that. Mary,
Could you just,
Okay.
I have, and I'll just show it to you, a map of the town of Louisburgh from that time. And each, you have it there, each house is numbered, and it equates with the list that I have in my left hand. Okay? So you know who's in it. Now, at the end of my book, I have the results of my visit to the valuations office in Dublin, which at that time, 30 years ago, was down in the bowels of some building. I forget the address now, but it's not anymore. And there were the big ledgers. And there I could make out who was living in such and such a house in, say, 1850, 51, 54, 55, whatever. And then who was there afterwards, and so on and so forth, right up to the present time. For example, you had a hotel on Chapel Street and Combers Hotel, so you have all the information about that. And then it became Grady's Hotel, and then it became McGuire's Hotel. Now, the McGuire's were originally from the north of Ireland, and I should have talked to you about this first. But I can talk to you about it now. In 1795, a Protestant rector up in Portadown, he preached a sermon on the 12th of July. What happened on the 12th of July? There was murder around the place, awful tension between the Catholics and the Protestants. And it came to a head in September where you had the Battle of the Diamond. And the result of that was that the Peep Day boys were the Protestants, I think, and you had the others. Defenders. Anyway, the Protestant groups won because they had arms, better arms and all of that. Thousands of Catholics, just like leaving a hand grenade on the table, just exploded. And 5,000 came to Mayo. And the landlords looked after them pretty well. For example, the McGuire's, the last of whom died a few months ago, and was a relation of mine, a second cousin of mine. They came from the north of Ireland and settled here up high in Killeen, because there was no land down low. Now, so there you have the town and all the people who lived in it. I have a problem though today, and it is this, and it's a very interesting problem. In the Turin list, Turin is just out the road, up by Chapter. You know, the primary school is out there. And right next door, just above the primary school, you have a house on 2 acres of land, which was sold recently or bought recently by some people. The owner was Patrick Ball, and be good to him, whom I mentioned earlier. He bought that house in 1954. And he bought it from Dr. O'Grady. But who owned it originally? It was owned, according to this, John Comber, Marquis of Sligo, okay, John Comber, the hotel man. The Reverend Martin McHale, his immediate lessor, Father Martin McHale, was this Father Patrick McManus. And Father Patrick McManus himself, his lessor was the Marquis of Sligo. The constabulary force were there, and they were paying. It's fine. It's you, is it? Thank God for that. Anyway, just think of the name Father McManus. In 1850. Mary, I need your help again to. No, you can hold on to that. And you take that, and I just want this one here. Now, this is interesting in local history. We're talking about Father McManus, one of the local priests of the parish, owning property. I have a copy here. The registrar, the registrar appointed pursuant to an Act of Parliament for registering deeds and leases and so forth in Ireland.
memorial of an indenture made on the 24th day of March 1851, between the Reverend Patrick McManus, PP of Louisburgh in the county of Mayo, of the one part, and the Most Reverend John McHale, Roman Catholic Archbishop of Tuam, of the other part. In other words, the priest, Father McManus, had to hand over the deeds of the house to the Archbishop of Tuam. Now, when I was growing up, there was a kind of a rumour that one of the priests had been nicking money from the famine fund, or had been an alcoholic, or had been something, you know. So, there you have it. He had to hand over the house to the Archbishop of Tuam. And that house and land, 2 acres, just over the road, would remain in the possession of the Archbishop of Tuam, later to become a Louisburgh man, Archbishop John McKevley, a friend of my own down in Bannow. So, you know, there you are, you find these things, and they're kind of strange, to say the least. Now, where am I going? We've gone through the famine, through the Great Famine. And it's not getting any better. I'm reading from a page here from my own book. A medical service did exist in the 19th century. By the way, I'll finish soon because I think it's very warm. Would you agree? Yeah. I bring you up to about the 20th century. Nothing much will a lot happen in the 21st too, but we might want to talk about some of those. A medical service did exist in the 19th century. So we have the schools now on the go. All right? Going fine right up to the present day. A medical service existed. The new school was built on the site of the old dispensary, and the new dispensary was across the road on Long Street. Doctors came and went. For example, in 1869, a meeting of the Louisburgh Dispensary District Committee was held in the Dispensary House at Turin, 1869. So how did we get a dispensary and so on, people and all of that kind of thing? I think I have, thanks for the Lord God. No, I haven't. Sorry again, Mary. Just hold on to that. Yeah, I have. Of course, you didn't doubt me at all. Here we go. This has to do with the Poor Relief Ireland Act. To be called the Medical Charities Act. It laid upon the Board of Guardians the duty of dividing their unions into dispensary districts. So each Board of Guardians had to have a dispensary districts in its area, in each of which a local committee would maintain a dispensary and appoint and pay a medical officer. Okay, not bad, really. But people are still dying. Father Ryan, the curate, brought about 100 people into the workhouse at Westport and they couldn't get in for anything, you know. But anyway, I want to read this for you. At the meeting, the names of 11 candidates were put forward for the post of dispensary doctor. Salary was £100 per annum, plus vaccination and registration fees, and a certainty, and this is a quote, a certainty of good remunerative practice. Dr. Lynch was elected to the position. Another appointment was made in 1876 when a Dr. Hamilton left for Achill, and Dr. Keyes was appointed in Louisburgh. Anyway, I have a list of all the doctors. The general state of public health is referred to. The general state of public health is referred to in a letter written by Reverend Patrick Greeley, Catholic curate, to the Guardians of the Westport Union. Father Greeley wrote from the presbytery on the 19th of December 1876. He complains of a family suffering from fever. The father and daughter had died. The entire family was ill, and the mother herself fever-struck. She had no one to help her, quote, wash the corpse, or much less assist to put it in the coffin. End of quote. Father Greeley continued, I must say it seems as if the lives of the people were not worth looking after. Priests can be pretty straightforward, now and again. It soon became clear that Father Greeley was not criticising the doctor, who had indeed tried his best. Dr. Keyes wrote stating that he had attended the patients. All this I did, though there were neither paying patients nor dispensary patients, as a red ticket was never presented on their behalf. That's what the doctor says. There was no money coming up. I did not order a nurse because such a course was not within my jurisdiction. I did not order a nurse, so there were nurses available. And there were public health nurses available right up to, and of course, including the present day. They were there at that time as well. But again, if you didn't have money, like that poor woman who was dying of fever, it's bye-bye Ireland. Now, Father Greeley alleged that the fever had been in the district since the previous July, that nothing had been done to ease the sanitary problems of the area. And I've one very, very good example. In what later became McDermott's Hotel down on Chapel Street, and John Durkin's Hotel, and so on and so forth, it's now gone and there's a new place there. You had the Devaney family. Now, all I could give the Devaney family when I wrote the book was one line. And on the evening of the publication of my history of Louisburgh, a man came up to me and he told me that he was a descendant of one of the Devaney children. So let's see who they were. Now you'll get all of this as well in Edward Gill's book, From Louisburgh to Clinton. Peter Devaney, a boatman and a fisherman, 1822 to 1877. He married Bridget Forrester, 1837, died in 1877. The family, 6 sons and 5 daughters. Margaret, John, Michael J., Patrick, Ellen, Peter, Bridget, James, Catherine, Mary Ann, and Frank. One day, now the lore is around here that the 2 parents died at the same time. But it would seem from the list that I got and the note that I got that while the husband, Peter Devaney, died on the 18th of January 77, Bridget, his wife, died on the 4th of February, some few weeks later. But the thing is this. All the kids eventually went to America. I have a note from the school rolls where Frank, the last chap I mentioned, was on the school rolls in 1877, the same year. But he's regarded now as an orphan. Frank went to America, never married, and died in the course of time. He died in 1937. Well, of course, naturally enough, they all died. But there they are. They were left without parents. And one of the girls, and it was Margaret, the eldest one, who said, I don't know whether I have it or not, Mary, because I do remember, she was asked later, would she like to go back to Ireland? And she says, yeah, I have been there all right, but she reckoned that the 2 parents had died. Nobody came to take the bodies for a few days. Now, it must have been ghastly. Until a man with his horse and cart came and relieved the situation and had the bodies buried in the burying grounds. Now, it doesn't say which, might have been probably Killeen. So there you go. At the same time, while all of this was going on, hardship and so on and so forth, and it was terrible, and I'm going to finish soon. That was 1876 or thereabouts, or 1877, okay? That's going on in Louisburgh, and if it went on in one place, it was going on all over the place, okay? Now, what else was going on around Louisburgh? Here's from 1879. In 1879, the social highlight in Louisburgh was the St. Patrick's Night Soiree. The second annual
of the League, held in rooms provided by Mrs. Hastings, that'll be where Gaffney's are now. Walter Heenan, according to the Telegraph of the next week, had tastefully decorated the walls with mottos which brought forth the unqualified praise of the guests as they poured into the rooms. Walter Heenan spoke of the great service provided by the priests, and he regretted the recent transfer of Father Greeley, who we mentioned. Father Joyce decried the abuse of drink, which had been, time out of mind, a source of many ills of the Irish. And Mr. Hines addressed the, quote, galaxy of wit and beauty. We still have lovely looking girls around here. Galaxy of wit and beauty, to use his own words. Among the ladies present were Miss Mackin, who played the harmonium, the Mrs. Sweeney, Mrs. Malley, Miss Davidson, Miss Kilmager, Miss McDermott, etc. It's probably time for me to finish now. But by the end of the century, two things were happening. You had the Land Acts were being brought into effect. Gladstone started that. Then you had the various Land Acts, which allowed the tenant farmers, it allowed them money, it gave them money to buy their own holdings. Holdings were valued at something like 18 times the annual rent, and the repayments would be over, say, 40 years at, say, 4%. So it was reasonable, apparently, because it worked. And by 1917, even the Sligos had to sell outside of the home ground their tenanted holdings. But they also got 12.5% of a bonus. But at least the people, my great-grandfather and your great-grandfather, Austin Francis, and everybody's great-grandfather, they were now owners of their own land. But they had to pay back the money in annuities every year. Okay, so we'll say £10 a year for the sake of argument. That was fine. And in 1921, we got our independence, 1922, 23, and so on. But those tenant farmers were still paying back the annuities to the government, and the government, the Free State government at the time, was handing over the money to Westminster. Until Fianna Fáil got into office, fully got into office in 1932, De Valera said, no way, we're not sending that 10 million a year, whatever it was, over to Westminster. Now, the ex-tenant farmers were still paying the money, but it was only getting as far as Dublin. By the 1938s, 39s, that all finished because there was a deal done. The British would move their forces out of some of the ports where they still were, and we would pay 10 million, and that would be that, end of story. So that's the story as to how we got our pieces of land. Now, let me tell you, and I'll finish up with this. I talked to you earlier about the dispossession that went on, and maybe I didn't, in 1851, immediately after the Great Famine. A man named Boswell Houston came from Scotland, and he, in the course of time, got around the then Lord Sligo to lease to him and to his son and whatever about 21,000 acres. If you go back to the Killery and take the whole lot through the mountains right across to Glenkeen and more, the people were dispossessed. They were thrown out. My great-grandfather was William O'Malley, living in Glenkeen. And we were always told that when the men, there were 15 families there or something, when the men came home from the fair, whichever fair it was, their houses were being knocked down and they were out. Now, William O'Malley and his then family, they went to, or got to Boris, got a place there. For those of you who know where the Joyces are now. So that was fine. More children came into the family, including my grandmother, Bridget O'Malley, a saint of a woman. Her father had 3 sons, 2 of whom became priests. Now, this is a man who's been dispossessed out of his holding, and he must have no money. But the 2 lads, William and John, at slightly different times, went to St. Jarlath's College in Tuam for 5 years, and went on to Maynooth for 7 years, all of which took money. So the father must have had money, or he at least was able to make it, because 10 years after he was dispossessed, he leased 58 acres from Lord Sligo. You know where you're coming along to Old Head Crossroads, go left for Old Head, keep going for Westport, up to the left there. Now he had to give back 10 acres or something for some reason or another, but he had the rest. He bought that out, and it went down through another line of the family, through the John MacDonald. Okay, fair enough. So that's the story of some of the people. But of course, what the Great Famine did, it finished dependence on the potato, it finished subdivision, and it started a huge movement of people to England and to America. But there's one little caveat. A group was set up towards the end, and I forget the exact date now. It seems that in some areas there were still too many people, and they had to be looked after in some way. And out of that came the Land Commission. Now, all of those people who were dispossessed in 1851, when we got our Free State, 1923-24, that Land Commission had to look at the books and says, God, there's 21,000 acres out there. What can we do with it? A bit like NAMA now. So what they did, they divided it up, and they got as many tenants as they could to go in and take 40 acres. And that's where Catherine in Glenkeen was a relation of mine. That's where her people came back in that way. So a lot of the people who were dispossessed at that time, they got back in again, or their sons or grandsons or whatever the case was. So look, I think I'm finished. I probably have left out a whole load of things. I hope you heard me down at the back, because I'll be asking questions now. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, and I hope this has been worth something to you, you know.
Thank you so much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, obviously the Louisburgh A History book, it's out of print since the last time it was reprinted, 2016, I think, is that correct?
Yeah.
But the thing about it is, you got a synopsis of the book tonight from John. So I want to say a sincere thank you, John, because I was not expecting us to have that, and fair play to you for doing it, because it was wonderful to go back into the history of Louisburgh, the foundation of Louisburgh, and even if you got one nugget of it, so thank you so much, John. Maybe we could look at reprinting?
Well, I'll tell you about that now. It was the Louisburgh traders at that time who funded the printing of the book, and they funded a reprint some years later. No, I don't think there's any Louisburgh traders. And I'm a poor pensioner, Mary.
Same with all the sales he made, surely there's money somewhere. But look, maybe we'll think about reprinting.
I'll tell you what I'd say. There may be somebody out there. Now, I have a load of stuff down in the house, and reference books and all that kind of thing. There may be a university student or somebody out there who might be doing a master's or a PhD in history, who will be welcome to take that book apart, to undo it, and to put it back together again as part of a thesis. Whoever comes to my door looking for help, looking for information, they're more than welcome. That's
and you always have been, John. Yeah, very, very welcome. I suppose it felt a little bit like being back at school in some ways, but not. I mean, he was a fantastic teacher. He tried his best with some of us, and more than the late Bill Mack and some Bill McMahon and so many more. But John, I just want to say thank you from, I suppose, the parish as well, because this book, you know, it was the first glimpse I ever had of the 1901 census, 1911 census, and I mean, everything is available digitally, or most things are now digitally recorded. So to think back 30 years ago, the efforts you went to document what you have in this book by having to travel to Dublin and so on, you know, to actually get the research done and go to the basements to find the little ledger things. And it wasn't easy because a lot of those places were off limits. you had to have permissions, you had to have consent and all that. So, you know, it meant a lot for us and inspired us to become, you know, custodians and historians as well, and to look at our history. And on that, I would just like to give you something small, a token of appreciation from the Louisburgh-Killeen Heritage Group. It's only something small. I know you have lots of Crow Patrick in the house and that, so we thought something different along the lines of either up here around, up here island.
Oh, that's good.
So there we go.
Thank you very much.
Something small. He's retired, you know, John is always at the end of the phone, the end of an email, he still sends me, you know, so much genealogy questions come in, and obviously the Village Shops project will be starting now, and that map again, there's a lot of foundations there, and whoever will come back to study this, it'll be a great base to start off with, you know, but we really appreciate all that you've done for Louisburgh over the years, and especially being co-editor and editor in the Cunha over the years as well, so thank you so much, John.
I just say with regard to Crow Patrick, people ask me why don't I climb the reek? I did twice when I was a teenager, I suppose because there were girls grown up as well, but anyway, I reckon that having reared 4 daughters, one of whom is here, that I had enough penance at Sealand.
Is there any questions for John before we go for a cup of tea? Anybody have any questions or any comments they'd like to make?
John, I have a question for you. I might be cursed in the church here now, but I've often noticed that several of the shops, one of the water houses in particular, opened. The date is on it just after the famine, 1847, 48 or so. I just wondered if you had a view about how that would have been viewed in the area at the time, because as you've gone through, there was a lot of famine and a lot of death at the time, and for businesses to open at the same time, I'm wondering whether that would have been seen as a good thing, or whether it would have been seen as kind of, you know, taking opportunity. And of course, I'm very fond of the McNamara, so I don't get out this one. I'm just wondering how it would have been seen, because there's quite a few that had opened just after the famine.
Yeah, but I'll put it to you this way. I remember I talked to you about if you had money, fine. If you didn't, there were 2, I suppose, nations. There were 2 layers in this parish and in other parishes. We are here because our people managed it. They had money all through that time. Shops were open. The fairs, I talked about the fairs, that John Dennis found a permission to have fairs and markets in Louisburgh. 4 major fairs, like in 1795, a market every Monday, and he would get tolls. By the end of the century, and I think this may answer your question, that number 4, now becomes 9. So I think that might answer your question. Business went on, not at all. Not at all. You will.
Just another question, if I may.
Yes.
You've spoken wonderful about the town, but how much of the following is correct? That you're talking about a tiny minority of the people. As I understand it, you can check me on these impressions as an amateur retired engineer. The land was teeming with very, very poor people.
Yeah.
Some of whom were in Conacre. In other words, they didn't even own any land.
Yeah.
They might get the privilege of working a half acre. And it was these desperately poor people.
That's right.
Who were mostly stricken by the failure of the famine, the potato.
Potato, yeah.
Secondly, I'm reading a history about why did the famine affect the poor areas of Ireland so badly compared to famines all over Europe. And basically it was to do with the land ownership and the degree to which there were so many levels of extracting money and from the labour of the lowest classes and on the way up, landlords upon landlords upon landlords. So there was no capital invested to improve the land, except as distinct from the rules in Northern Ireland, which allowed people to improve the land.
Yeah. So
it was dictated the impact, the devastating impact of maybe the death of 1 million people before the emigration started, that it was based on the structures of land ownership. Finally, there was you mentioned the good things that the government did eventually over time.
Yeah.
But the philosophy of the free market was very current. and the rules about Malthusian ideas. You do not interfere with the free market.
Yes.
That it was Providence that dictated that the weak would fade away, and that there were many people in the ruling establishment in England who said, the liberal establishment said, it's Providence that the weak of the Irish race should be eliminated because it's actually good for them.
I just
And
remember.
finally on the schools, I trust that the schools were all English speaking. And is it correct that the mass of the people were Irish speaking and never saw school? Say
That's
70%
right, yeah.
never saw school.
There was.
Correct me on these outcomes.
I know there was a verse on the wall in all the well, it's supposed to be in all the primary schools. Here's the verse: I thank the goodness and the grace that on my face has smiled, and made me in these Christian days a happy English child. Oh, I knew that would get you. No, Trevelyan was the minister for affairs in England at the time of the famine, and he believed in laissez-faire, let it alone, let it take its course. Now, I told you that there were something like 13,000 people or something living in this parish. That was a lot, to say the least of it. Now, I'm not going to say that was too much, because they were our people, but it was a lot. And then when the food source finished, for example, you had the cottagers, the cottier classes, who didn't have any land. They worked for the bigger farmers, and they got a certain amount of farm manure for digging for their potatoes down at the end of the field or whatever. They paid the farmer that. They got nothing for nothing. They paid for everything. When the Great Hunger came, and the others, they disappeared. Bye-bye. So that's kind of answers your questions, I hope.
Just an observation. I'm from Sligo, so I'm a blow-in, but my in-laws, my daughter-in-law's grandfather was the sergeant here in Louisburgh, Sergeant Hannon. So
his wife taught us, yeah.
Yeah. So I started coming here with Ailish, and all the Hannons meet here every summer for a week.
Yeah.
And they take all the cottages out there.
That's right.
Yes, right. So then we heard, gosh, of course, all the rest of it. So we were invited then. My sons were the Hodsons. So we came along and fell in love with Louisburgh and all the rest of it. So we heard an awful lot about Louisburgh. So I came here on behalf of the family. I'm a part of Tom Hannon and his son Michael, who is the tenor.
Yep.
He's my daughter-in-law's father. So I just texted there a while ago and I said, this is very interesting. Michael would love to hear this. So we'd be interested in the recording, definitely. And bring it back to Michael. He's a great man and lovely tenor. He's school teacher as well.
That's right.
You probably know.
Primary teacher.
That's right.
Yeah.
And his wife was a secondary school teacher,
That's right.
Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was the O'Donnells.
From
And
Donegal.
that's her from Donegal, that's right. So it's hugely interesting. I can't
Great.
believe it. But I mean, my own observation is, and I'm hugely interested in that I've looked at the 1901 census and all the rest from my own family history. And I just had a group launch there myself in July. But anyway, apart from that, I'm hugely interested in, we were to Hello to Connacht kind of background, and we did live on lush land one time, and then we were fecked off to the bottom of the mountain, and we were the McGoldricks. But anyway, I was always interested in how did we survive? Why am I here? Like, why did the family survive? And my great grandfather married at the end of around that, about 1880, around that time. And he would have been born like just after the famine, or just around that time, and ended up having 9 children. And of those 9, 7 immigrated to the US. But how did they survive? Also, the depossession to me is horrendous. I understand it, but I find it very difficult. And the other thing that I would be hugely passionate about is the whole oppression of education. If you want to oppress people, don't educate them. And I don't sit on any side of the church, one way or the other, But I do think that story, and obviously I've heard it before, where the Bible, you wouldn't be allowed to interpret the Bible, for God's sake. As a Christian, particularly a Catholic, you needed another Catholic, i.e. in the hierarchy, to interpret the Bible for you, which I think is an absolute thundering disgrace, and that's why we have ended up being part of the reason we've been so oppressed.
I'll tell you a nice
I'm
story.
talking speech box now.
I'll tell you a nice story from about the 1860s, 1870s. Down at the end of Main Street, right beside the church gates, there was a house with O'Malley's. There were 3 girls in the family. There was Bridget, there was Mary, and there was Rose. And one son, Tony. Tony was the sacristan in the church. Rose was in the choir. But Mary, Bridget married John Bow, the OWE, who had come up from Wexford as a coachman for the Wilbrahams. Right? That family were here up to recent times. James is still on the go. Mary, anyway, Rose never married, to the best of my knowledge. Tony was the sacristan. I'll tell you the story about Tony in a moment. Mary, anyway, clapped her eye on one of the RIC lads, a Cork man, a man named Keefe. Now, there was no O's, there was no O'Malley in those days, it was all Malley, or Brian, or this man was Keefe, Michael Keefe. And they clapped their eyes on each other and everything was grand, and they got married. And then they were transferred to Ballinagar in County Roscommon. And eventually they died, and they're both buried in the old graveyard in Killeen. But they had a family. And they had one son, they had a son, among others, named Patrick. And Patrick, the father was a Corkman, of course. Patrick had to go down and go to UCC, University College Cork. And he did, and he was into politics at the time and so on, it was 1916 and all of that kind of thing. Anyway, to make a long story short, he became president of the GAA, and there's a field down in Cork named after him, Pádraig Ó Cuív. So Pádraig Ó Cuív's mammy was Mary O'Malley from our street.
There's a bit of history.
No.
There's a bit of history now. It is indeed.
Okay.
No, there's a great one about Tony. Father Joyce was parish priest here in Louisburgh. Now, Father Joyce was the kind of a man, he'd fight with his toenails, as would the then Archbishop of Tuam, Archbishop McKevely, who was from Bannow. No, I have to be very careful.
Those banana people.
Archbishop McKevely, he transferred a curate from here to Annadown in County Galway. Nothing wrong with that. But Father Joyce got up on the pulpit the next Sunday, and he ranted and raved and gave out about the parish priest, about the Archbishop. And of course, word filtered back to Tuam from the Archbishop's, presumably 2 sisters. So the Archbishop sent down, and I have a copy of it down in the house, he sent down a copy of the apology that the priest would read out on the next Sunday. And the priest did. But Tony O'Malley had filled the gallery with fine lads with boots and whatever you want yourself. And the minute the priest started talking about apologising, the lads started making a racket. The priest apologised. Nobody had done it.
That's a good way to do it.
We could be going on all night, you know, but I take one more question, maybe if
Is there any other questions?
yeah, down at the very end.
Just a quick one. I just wondered when you got the new name, the Gaelic name, Caravan, sorry, I don't know Irish.
Cloncarabon.
Oh yeah.
Middle of the buttons. Yeah.
I'll explain to you in this way. Louisburgh is situated in a site of 16 acres, but it's situated in the townland of Cloncarabon. Back in the Normans started this racket. If you take, I think 148 acres I take as a barony. We're in the barony of Murrisk. Then you can divide that down. A townland would be roughly a quarter of that, or thereabouts. Now, dependent on mountains and rivers and all of that kind of stuff. But it's in the townland of Clúin-Carabán. Clúin is a field. Carabán would be the white buttercups, the field of the white buttercups, yeah, something like that. Clúin-Carabán. If I give you another example, Clontarf in Dublin. Clúin-Tarf, the field of the bull. That's where the famous battle of Clontarf took place in 1014.
Oh my God.
Clonakilty would be another one, and so on. So will we put an end to it? Austin Francis, yeah?
In relation to Bishop McKelvey, would he be buried in Killeen by any chance?
He'd be buried in June. He'd be buried in June.
No,
Yeah.
because I thought there was something in Killeen.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.